This is part 2 of our History Terms and Concepts lecture. So the next terminology I want you to be familiar with are sensitive and critical periods. So a critical period is a time when something has to happen. So originally developmentalists believed all humans had critical periods for development, a period of time during which an event has its greatest consequence or effect. So some events must occur during critical periods for development to proceed normally. For example, if an animal lives in a completely dark environment during the first few weeks of life, the visual center of the brain will atrophy and they will have permanent vision impairment. So they have a critical period for their brain and eyes to be exposed to light in order for their brain to be able to see and process it. Another example, prenatal exposure to large amounts of alcohol can lead to mental retardation in the fetus. So the presence of a toxic agent during a critical period can have long-standing effects. If the fetus is exposed to bad things when the brain is developing, then the brain will suffer. So critical periods happen a lot in prenatal development. An example of critical periods is imprinting. Konrad Lorenz. So he worked with newborn geese and he wanted to see if he could get them to imprint on a human. So he found that geese imprinted on whoever they saw shortly after they hatched. And then after the critical period passed, they could never imprint on anyone else. So there's a very short period of time in which geese imprint on their mother, so to speak. But Konrad Lorenz showed that he could get them to imprint on him, essentially seeing him as their mother. And these geese followed him everywhere, seeing him as their mother. So there's lots of pictures of Lorenz being followed by geese everywhere he goes. So critical periods do exist in child development, especially in the prenatal stage. But over the last few decades, critical periods have become less important, and now more people use the term sensitive periods, which means that it's a time when something is easier, but not necessary. So we have discovered a lot about brain plasticity. This is the ability of the brain to rewire itself and to physically change as it encounters new needs. So we found that the brain has much more plasticity than was originally thought. It is better able to accommodate deprivation and has an amazing ability to rewire itself. This rewiring becomes harder as we age, but not impossible. So a 4-year-old is more likely to have their brain change physically than a 40-year-old, but it's always possible. There have been cases of people who have lost an entire hemisphere of their brain, and yet they can still learn to function normally. So the brain has an amazing power to fix itself and to overcome deprivation and hardship. For example, language. If anyone is currently trying to learn a new language, you'll find that as an adult, it's a lot harder to learn. It's not impossible. You can learn a new language, but it takes a lot more time, and you'll probably never be able to speak as well as a native. So your sensitive period for learning a language has passed. It's still possible, but much harder. A young child trying to learn the same language will learn it much faster, and they may even gain the ability to speak it as well as a native would. So existing research supports the idea that infants have the ability to discriminate the sounds for every language, but those get pruned over the second 6 months of life. So we do have a sensitive period for learning language, but it's not a critical period because you can still learn after that period has passed. So here's your first quest. What I want you to do is look up the story of Jeannie. Email me with a paragraph or two summarizing her story and what it teaches us about critical and sensitive periods. Okay, so just send me a short email telling me that you've read her story and you understand how it fits with this lecture material, and I will give you 10 XP. Our next topic, we're going to talk about some major debates in development. These are debates that are still going on, that haven't been resolved, and probably never will be fully. So the first is active versus passive. Are children active, pre-wired to act on the world, or passive, shaped by experience? This is one of the biggest debates in the field of child development. Are children born with the ability to learn on their own and to develop on their own, or do they have to have the input of the environment? So, John Locke, he would have believed that it was passive. Okay? He thought it was all environment that influenced children. They weren't born with anything. Rousseau was the opposite. He thought that children drove their own development, so he would say active development. The behaviorists in the 50s and 60s, again, they are all about environment, so they would say passive development. We'll cover other theorists who are firmly in the active camp as well. So it depends on the theory and the theorist and the domain that you're studying, whether development is more active or passive. But what you believe changes your approach to development. So educators who believe children are active encourage open education, where the children's interests and talents are supported. So they believe that children should explore an environment filled with educational materials. But educators who believe children are passive assume the child must be motivated to learn. So they provide traditional curriculum with exercises in spelling, math, reading, etc. They use the grill and drill approach, which is lots of worksheets. In reality, there's a great variation both between and within children. What that means is that each child is different. One child might be a very active learner and one might be a passive learner. Or even within that same child, maybe they're a very active learner in math, but a passive learner in reading. So there's a lot of differences both personally and with what subject is being covered or what domain of development is being covered. The next is continuous versus discontinuous. Does development happen gradually or in stages? So here's a picture. The first one shows more of a continuous development. Changes happen very slowly at a time. So you gradually add more of the same type of skills that were there to begin with. So learning theorists, behaviorists would believe more in this continuous development. Discontinuous development is a process in which new understanding and responding to the world emerge at separate times. So any theorist who has stages, which are most of the ones we will be covering, believe in more discontinuous development. There's some big gap between certain ages that create this huge qualitative change in the way children act or think. And they would be more discontinuous. So there is some debate whether development occurs in a step-like process or in the more continuous gradual process. So an example of this is a butterfly can be seen as a discontinuous development. It has discrete life stages, each of which is qualitatively different. So the insect relates to the world in different ways when it's a caterpillar versus a butterfly. So you could really break down its development into stages in which it relates to the world vastly differently. So that would be a discontinuous development. So one of the major theorists we'll be covering is Piaget, and he had a discontinuous development theory. In a continuous viewpoint, new skills build on previous skills, and it's very, very gradual over time. So an example might be the development of an animal that grows slowly, but the adult form still resembles the child form. Look at a cat. A kitten looks a lot like an adult cat. It's just very slow changes over the course of its development. Most likely, human development follows a hybrid trajectory in which there are stages of development, but change happens gradually within each stage. Also, the area of development matters. Some might be more continuous and some more discontinuous. The last debate is nature versus nurture. This is the degree to which genetic or hereditary influences, or nature, and experience or environmental influences, nurture, determine the kind of person you are. So on the nature side, that's heredity. Those are your genes. We are who we are because of our genes. We inherit from our parents. So the studies of heredity and genetics are all looking at the nature side. Nurture is the environment. We are who we are because of the environment we were raised in, our parenting, the neighborhood, nutrition, things like that. So those are examples of nature versus nurture. There's a whole field of science out there called epigenetics. This is the science of the interaction between nature and nurture. It's the study of how environmental factors affect genes and genetic expression, enhancing, halting, shaping, or altering the expressions of genes. For instance, two people might be born with the same genetic potential to get diabetes, but one person develops diabetes and one doesn't. So epigenetics would study how environmental influences change the way those genes are expressed. So this might be why some people have high susceptibility to illness but never seem to get sick. So they have the genetics for one thing, but nature and nurture have led them different ways. So there's this idea called differential susceptibility. This is the idea that people vary in how sensitive they are to particular experiences. Often such differences are genetic, which makes some people affected for better or for worse by life events. So the way a person reacts to an event may depend on genetics or their previous experiences. Think about the people you know. The exact same event might make one person fall apart, but may not seem to affect another person at all. Two people may be exposed to the same cold virus, but one gets much more sick than the other. This is called differential susceptibility. There's also male-female differences. There are hormonal and biological differences between males and females, but is that all there is to it? Is it just biological? Is it just genetics? It used to be believed that biology made females inferior in math, but is that true? Modern research shows very little difference, and in some cases girls perform better than boys. Therefore, was it nurture keeping girls from being good at math? As you should have learned in an intro to psychology class, there is a difference between sex and gender. Sex is the genetics you were born with, the X or the Y chromosome. But gender is how you express yourself and live your life. Gender and sex usually coincide, but not always. In gender differences, as in everything else, there's an interaction effect between nature and nurture. And we're going to be covering gender differences a lot in this class. And if you're interested in it, the book I suggest you pick is called Pink Brain, Blue Brain. It really talks about gender differences. So this is when I want you to ask any questions. I will create a forum on Blackboard, and if you have any questions at all about this topic, please post it there, and either your classmates or myself will answer them. That's it for this topic.